a joke to think we wouldn't have technical difficulties. We'll see if we can continue now with this. So, back to the trade routes. So, West Africa, Holland. A very well established relationship of trade. And the way that this cloth gets manufactured is that they come into sort of like design agreements, right? So Vlisco in particular, which is a company that's in Holland, started to produce fabric that was more reflective, more collaborative with different kinds of aesthetics that may be appealing to West African taste. And so this really distinctive cloth gave rise to this really distinctive cloth, and established a very strong market between an elite few, not necessarily meaning that they were, elite at the onset, but a group of women called the non-abeds, and this is mostly happening in the 1950s. Into the 60s and on, where there's this really interesting sort of collusion, or this interesting laminating between the rise of a monopolized market by this sort of like group of merchant women with the trade agreements and relationships with designers, manufacturers in Holland, and Vlisco in particular, and the nation state. And so there is an enormous shift in this period of time in regard to sort of like political regime. And so in this sort of conservative monopolizing moment, these trade agreements with the opening of certain elements of the coast, and this, again, very complex, read the book, you'll enjoy it, but created this legally monopolized, highly insular group of people who could make claims about the distinction and the quality of this fabric, and sort of like be able to discuss with the manufacturers what was desirable, and then be able to have complete control of that over the market for then West Africans themselves. But also in what ways there were rhetorics being associated with this fabric as being part of like the national cloth, right? So it was something that started to represent what it means to be African. So there's this really fascinating idea of that, identity, as we might identify it as something that is coming from the ground up, something that's very local, is often manufactured or is in collaboration with people from thousands and thousands of miles away, right? So that is sort of like one of the classic, interesting ways of addressing this type of fabric in anthropology. However, Nina Sylvanus is interested then in what happens when that's starting to change, and in when neoliberal practice and legality that's associated with that, and ideology that's associated with opening borders and lowering tariffs and being able to manufacture goods somewhere else for a better profitable price for the corporation and non-local corporation. What happens when these things start to challenge the monopoly of the non-abends, first of all, which again were this group of merchants who were very, very powerful? What happens then when their daughters and their granddaughters aren't able to inherit necessarily the same kind of trade agreement, because it's being diversified, and these fabrics are now being made in different areas, and now there are claims about that those fabrics are counterfeit and that they're fake and that they're inferior. So when trade starts to open up between now China and West Africa, and that's partially what Nina Sylvanus was engaging with, is again, a host of discourse about China and Africa encounters. You start to see responses from the ground. So all of these kinds of relationships that are informed by seafaring, by trade that's happening between far off places that perhaps had never been, start to have direct effects for locality and for moral claims on people that are coming then from, as a result of these new trade agreements, right? These sort of phatic trade agreements. So with this manufacture, part of this new manufacture that's now happening in China, we're seeing an incredible response of evaluating judgments on what kinds of persons have access to legitimate cloth. So you're seeing naysaying and tearing down and defaming not only of certain kinds of cloth by saying it's, again, inferior, it's cheap, it falls apart when you wash it, you know, it's not traditional, it's not a product of these agreements that we had. But you're also starting to see these claims about, well, the poor woman who got murdered in the beginning, she must have also been drug dealing. And there's no way that she could have built the rapport, she could have built the relationship that's necessary for a quality cloth by going to China once. And there's no way that you can really trust, first of all, the Chinese businessmen. And there's maybe no way that we can necessarily trust those who are involved in this kind of trade, right? So it starts to create this type of distinction. Now, I want this to be explicitly clear. This article is not about West African people being racists. That's not what this is about at all. At all. Strike that from the record. Rather, this is about understanding how shifts in not only just commodity change, but shifts in relationships that are indexed onto the land, even though they're not local, even though they're trade relationships with areas across the world, those still have incredible bearing on how people negotiate their prestige, their position, how they negotiate what seems to be logical for law and regulation. And when competing narratives for that appear, what kinds of responses might come from that? What kinds of ways we might then try to again legitimize good versus bad in order to keep the claim of your monopoly in one way, of a different way of life, of a different kind of both legal and economic and nation state system, but also how we use these kinds of things out of a response of when we're seeing our power be challenged, when we're seeing our power dissolving in certain ways through things like new capabilities, new abilities to make similar objects. So that's the food for thought that I want us to leave with. Not about racism and about how, you know, people respond to difference through trying to throw you out of the group. None of that old chestnut. But what I want us to think about is how these material worlds have extreme bearing on how we're informed and what we think is normalized in regard to value judgments that are associated with real legal implications behind that. So that's the food for thought. Again, just a very brief little idea. This is a really rich discourse. Again, thinking about clothes, very relevant. Thinking about material stuff, very relevant. And so I just hope that you enjoy thinking this through and that at least there was a little something in that article that was useful. All right, so stay well, stay inside, and stay brilliant.